Thank you very much, Christina, for hosting us, and welcome everybody. We're really welcome this opportunity to share a favorite topic of ours with you. The title focuses on wheelchair skills training, but really the motor skills learning principles can be applied to any motor learning situation, whether it's putting on a splint or tying your shoelaces and so forth. We just happen to have worked a lot with wheelchair skills, and so that's what where our focus will be during the examples that we give. I'll be starting off with the first number of slides. Cher will do the meat of the motor skills section, and then I'll kick in at the end. So just to set the stage, we don't have any conflicts of interest to declare. We would like to acknowledge quite a large wheelchair research team, both locally and internationally. Our target audience, of course, is occupational therapists, given it's a CAOT webinar. The disclaimers are that we don't consider ourselves experts on motor skills learning. That's a specialty area in people with neuroscience degrees and PhDs in that area, but we use them a lot, and so we'll consider ourselves enthusiastic amateurs when it comes to motor skills learning, would probably be the way to put it. We have permission from the people whose photos or videos are shown, so no need to worry about that. As far as a handout goes, a PDF of this presentation was distributed to you already, I do believe, and as well as a reference list. As far as questions, put them in the chat box at any stage. Christine is going to be monitoring it, and so we can stop and answer a question as we go along, or we can wait until the end. There'll be some time for questions then, or you can email either Cher or me afterwards if you prefer to do that. So this is the outline of the presentation. We're going to start with goals and objectives, define our terms, talk about the extent of literature, then get into the meat of it, the principles of motor skill learning that Cher will be tackling. And then I'll talk about some of the evidence about whether or not it's useful, and then a couple of things at the end about resources. So let's start with our goals and objectives. And I think a quote by Marcus Spear way back in 1998 is worth going over, and I'll just let you read that yourself. This was true then, it's also true now, and really it's the background for why we're put together this webinar. So our broad goals are to better acquaint you. I'm sure you're already quite familiar with the principles of motor skill learning, but to perhaps better acquaint you with them, and to allow you to be more deliberate in your use of them in both your professional and personal lives. I kind of use it when I'm practicing my squash swing, for instance, as far as the personal part goes. I rely on these. It hasn't helped much, but that's probably me. So the more specific objectives of the presentation, at the end of this session, we hope that you'll be able to briefly describe what we mean by motor skills learning and list the 10 principles of motor skill learning that we'll come to a little later, and perhaps describe how those principles might be used in your own settings. So moving on to defining our terms, we're using the terms training, and we do so in the same way that the World Health Organization does. Back in 2008, they came out with these guidelines on the provision of manual wheelchairs in less resource settings. It quickly became apparent that these weren't just for manual wheelchairs, and they weren't just for less resource settings. They're widely used. You'll hear people talking about the 8-step process, and I'll give you the 8 steps in a minute. Just as of the end of April 2023, these have been updated, and you'll see the slight change there. So these are the 2008 8-step process. You'll see them, the 8 steps listed here, which won't come as any surprise to any of you who are involved in assistive technology service delivery. User training is step number 7 here in the 8-step process. However, if we look at the 2023 guidelines, they boiled those 8 steps down into 4, and number 3 is the training piece of that. This is from the 2023 document, which is freely available on the WHO website, by the way. And this just shows the select, fitting, training, and follow-up steps sort of graphically, which I think is rather nice. Now, teaching and learning are not exactly the same thing. And this little cartoon, I think, makes that point. I'll just let you read that on your own. So we may think that we've taught somebody something, but that doesn't mean they've actually learned it. And it's learning we're really interested in, not just so we can tick it off a box saying, yeah, I taught that. McGill, who's the details of how to access their excellent book, defines motor skill as shown here. And again, you can read it yourself, but I'll focus a little bit on the fact that something that's voluntary, there are movements involved, and it has to be sort of goal related, that you're doing it for a purpose. You're not just yawning and unless you're yawning for a purpose. The types of motor skills can range from gross to fine, very discrete ones, to more continuous ones like playing soccer, closed skills like doing a golf swing off the tee, or open skills, again, sort of open field running in soccer, for instance. So there's a wide range of types of motor skills that may be of interest. So we're going to switch over to the extent of the literature briefly here. And this is back in March. I didn't update this recently, but if you put into PubMed the terms motor skills, you get over 39,000 hits. If you try to narrow it down by saying motor skills and learning, it narrows it down more, or education, more instruction, more clinical, even further sport, music. So you get an idea of how large a field this is. I get a weekly email on the basis of anything new in motor skills in the previous week. And typically, as shown down here, it's around 50 a week in the English literature. Many of those are like this, which I wouldn't understand if I did open it. They just get to do with the basic science underlying motor skills. So I tend to skip those ones and focus more on ones that deal with the neurological system as a black box, as defined here, which kind of reflects my understanding of the neurological system, I must say. So what I would tend to pick out each week would be something like this: how you use some of these principles in the acquisition of skills for soccer, for instance, and practice design, coaching behavior, the ones that have some clinical relevance for the wheelchair skills program is why we're monitoring these. So having mentioned the wheelchair skills programs, this is what our website looks like. The web address is at the bottom. It may be clipped off in your view there, but it's in your reference list, so you can be able to find it there. And you'll see there's a series of menu items over here, and then our Facebook contact and our YouTube contact, and we'll get on with that in just one moment here. The wheelchair skills program really is a set of resources related to the assessment and training of wheelchair skills. The assessment piece is the wheelchair skills test, the WST, which it has a questionnaire version as well, the WSTQ. We're not going to deal with that because we're focusing on training today. The second part is wheelchair skills training program, the WSTP, and that is what we're going to focus on, at least the general gist of it. So the wheelchair skills training program consists of two components: the process, how to teach, our main focus today, and the content, what to teach. We'll use a few examples here, but the two together are what constitutes the WSTP. So just as an example of the content, this is a video that shows a highly skilled peer trainer. This was in Kathmandu in Nepal when Cher and I visited there to take part in a peer training workshop. But you'll see how he comes down the stairs here, and his technique is literally flawless. You could not find any better example of the content. Now that's an advanced variation of the stair descent. We would train people to come down backwards holding onto the rail, or to get out of the chair and come down on their buttocks, but that's an advanced version that we do have in our manual. The process is the how to teach, which is what we're talking about today, those principles of motor skills learning, and Cher is going to take over for the next few slides. Just let me know when you want to advance, Cher.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the background, the general background, and then we'll move into trainer do's and don'ts. So if you can just next 2 slides, I think actually. Yeah. So when we look at the stages of motor learning, the early stages, as we've all experienced this in learning new skills, it's inconsistent. We can't do it in different environments or stressful situations. Then we're able to acquire the skill, becomes more consistent, it's less effortful. We'll see retention. So from attempt to attempt over different days or periods of time, we're better able to perform it. Next is a skill transfer. So we can use that skill in different environments. And then it becomes quite autonomous or automatic. And that is different from expertise. And it doesn't mean we're doing it expertly, it's that we're doing it quite automatically. So we can be doing it not very well, but very consistently. So here's a good example of skill transfer. So teaching someone a skill in a structured setting or environment. So that's great. She's able to get up there and she's able to do it quite easily and efficiently. And we take this into a real outside environment and you see that it becomes a bit more challenging, but she's still able to do it. So that's really our goal. It's great that we can teach people inside, but we want people to be using their skills in all sorts of environments. All right, so as we learn motor skills, it's not linear. It would be great if you just got a little bit better each day, but that's not how it tends to work. So we often see rapid improvements. There can be a plateau where we are like, oh, I thought I'd be getting it better at this, but that doesn't mean the game is over. There can still be significant gains after that. And there may be abrupt transitions. So we might be doing a skill at a certain level and all of a sudden there's a big leap in our abilities. So we just have to remind our folks that we're training that it's not the straight line that goes a little bit better each day, and that's okay. Thank you. When it comes to learning, there's 2 different types we have of aspects of learning. So there's the facts and ideas, or that cognitive aspect, or then the performance, which is the motor skill. They can be acquired independently, or they can be acquired together. There's no fixed order if you're acquiring both of them. And they can interfere with each other. So if you think of the example of choking, if you're overthinking something and you're putting too much of a cognitive attention to the motor skill, then that can have a negative impact on it. And skills can be learned by discovery, so intrinsic learning. So I'll just show you an example with the next slide in the video, thanks, Lee. So this is an ask of to get the wheelchair up the curb. And so the initial attempt by this gentleman who is using a prosthetic limb and who has had a stroke is challenging. But you see he makes an adjustment, changes where his weight is. As a spotter, this is absolutely treacherous, trying to figure out what he's going to do next. Didn't see this one coming, but here we go. You can see by just the experience of doing this skill, he's problem solving, he's learning. That's intrinsic learning that's occurring. Puts his brakes on, and able to transfer back in. So his initial idea didn't work, but he was able to adjust and problem solve his way through that. Another example of intrinsic learning can be seen here. So for reasons I won't get into too much, he should have done better on the first attempt because of a medication situation. And so he's trying to get over this little pothole here. He really struggles. So we test him a couple of days later when he's not on his medication, and we think, oh, he's going to have more struggles. But what we see, in fact, is that in spite of the medication situation, there's intrinsic learning that happened on that first attempt, that first testing. And again, spotting nightmare, trying to figure out where the heck to be. And he moves footrest out of the way. He readjusts his plan.
And it was interesting here that the couple of days between the two were a weekend. He had no training or opportunity to practice on his own.
Yeah, it's absolutely intrinsic. No other, that retention or that problem solving on his own. So now we're going to look at some do's and don'ts of trainers. There's basically an instruction toolkit. And with this, you won't use every tool every time for every person. You won't need it, but it's really nice to have a bunch of different tools in your kit. So there's 10 that we'll go through, and we'll start with the assessment. So that general clinical assessment, when we're speaking specifically of wheelchair skills, that may include looking at the equipment they have, how it's set up. Is the chair programmed well? Is there a good setup to it? And then the wheelchair skills test. So with the wheelchair skills test, the WST, we're actually observing them perform the skills. And with that, there's the added benefit of being able to see exactly how they're doing the skill and what areas we can focus on for improvement. The downside of that is that intrinsic learning that we just demonstrated. So you may have an inflated baseline with that because even as they're doing the test, they may be learning different methods. The wheelchair skills questionnaire, WSTQ, it really takes away that. It's just you're asking them to tell you how, if they would do it and how they could do it. But it does have the negative side of you can't actually observe them doing it, and that doesn't happen until the training part. So that's the downside of that one. Here's a wheelchair skills test, and this is just a great example of someone saying yes or no, I can't go through gravel, but if you actually watch them, and you'll see this young person's really struggling getting through here. And there's one thing that could change is that all of her, which is a very common thing, is people leaning forward and to push harder. But what you're doing when you're leaning forward is actually putting more weight on those casters and digging them in there. So just by observing that quickly, you can see I'm going to be able to give this person one piece of feedback, should change the outcome or the ease of this skill.
Yes, it's just by way of comment there. In the WST scoring, she would get a 2 because she got through the soft surface successfully, but she wouldn't have a 3, which would be an advanced pass because there's room for improvement in how she did it to reduce the effort and take the tip that Cher was just talking about.
So for goal setting, we want to do this prior to training. It can be a joint activity, but essentially we want to ask folks, what would you like to do as far as a wheelchair skill? And it may be that we have to work with a person to make sure that it's sort of a SMART goal that is brief, specific, significant, achievable, and observable. So an example might be, oh, I'd like to garden. So we may work together to break that down. Well, what is about it that you need the skill? And it could be that they need to transfer down to the ground because their gardens are not raised. And so it's actually that transferring in and out of the chair. And is that going to be with the assistance of one? Is that going to be independently? So really breaking those skills down and making them meaningful and also making them specific enough that you can assess them. With motivation, it is very important, and like a good goal is a good place to start, basically, because if it's a meaningful activity that you want to participate in, you're much more likely to be motivated by that. The use of games is great. It's great for children as a primary way of learning, but it's also great for adults to get them engaged. Rewards can be helpful. The rewards don't have to be huge. It can literally be a gold star list that goes on the wall. It can be something that they're showing a family member as to how they've gotten better. It doesn't have to be anything grand. Cooperation versus competition. If you have people that are working at a similar level, it's fair to have them compete against each other. You just want to make sure that it's going to be friendly and fairly even competition. Yes, and then letting people know that there will be a test is helpful for people performing, and it actually has a positive impact on skill acquisition. Here's an example of a game, which can just make learning fun. So how fast can you get around the pylons and get back to that ball? That's fun every time. And this is a great example of just the joy of learning. So what's the reward here? Everyone's learning together. That's a great moment for everyone. The reward is that everyone witnessed how well they did. Do I have training tips for them? Sure. But the fact that they're learning and you wait till the end, see how happy they are. Awesome. The true joy of learning.
Oh, sorry, did I go one too far?
No, that's great. No, that's good. No, you're right. You're on. So individualization. We want to make sure that we personalize training for everyone. It is not an assembly line. So what are the person's personal characteristics? So there's, I won't get into too much detail, but in the manual, there's some very specific training tips depending on which population you're working with. So for an example, it could be working with a population with stroke or some with cognitive impairments. And if that's the case, you might want to focus on like more errorless learning. So making sure that we're giving them the right fit for training. Learning styles can be really important. So for an example, you might be using videos for training. So if someone is really an auditory learner, just have them listen for the sounds while you're training them. If they're visual learner, you can look at the audio and have them focus on specific parts. There's lots of different ways that we can tailor our training to our client, as long as we've paid attention and asked them, and observe how they best learn. Problem solving exercises, basically you can take an activity and say, okay, how are we going to do this? Let's do this together. Let's see what you can achieve and what outcomes you can come from, or you can get from this. And that can be having very positive, long-lasting results from using that problem solving exercise or focus. I think, yeah. So structure, there's lots of room for structure in doing group sessions, but there's also abilities to just take a teaching moment. So if you're going down an elevator with someone and there's a gap, why don't we just take a moment here to practice getting over gaps? You can take those teachable moments and not have to make everything completely structured. When you're doing scheduling sessions, it's good that they are with regular frequency and not too long of a time, because that can be really difficult on people. Learning lesson plans that can include warm-ups and cool downs. Also, training can happen once you've got a certain amount of skill at home. So we know from literature that home-based training with a tablet can be helpful. You want to make sure you have a spotter available and you've got those lesson plans worked out. Training in pairs and groups can be great. You want to make sure that we're, again, matching people. You don't want to have people with too much difference as far as their skill level. If they're nice and close, then they'll be able to look and learn from each other as they see them learning the skills. And I think then we've learned so much from training in groups and training from pairs and things like that. So sometimes when we do training with university students, we have stations and we run everyone through the station, and we start with the easier skills and move our way along. When we're sometimes in groups, we have everybody going at once, either in a line or a static line, which I think is in the next slide here, Lee. So this is in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we are teaching how to do caregiver up a curb, and this is getting everyone on what we would call a chorus line. So there's lots of different ways that we can be creative and matching our needs to our teaching styles. So demonstration is probably the most powerful one that we have, and it's most effective for novel skills. The model can be someone that's highly skilled, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be a video if you're unable to do it yourself. But also, I think some of the best learning moments I can remember is like clients working with new therapists and the joy that they get from watching someone struggle with them, and they're still learning along the way. Demonstration. So we want to just actually demonstrate the skill and not talk too much, which is one of our challenges for sure. As educators, we tend to speak too much and try and keep it silent while we're doing that demonstration. If you're doing a verbal description, that can be the second time you demonstrate it, and then you can repeat those demonstrations as often as needed. Here's an example of how to have a longer push. And so demonstrating reaching down towards that axle. And I will have to do a disclaimer. This is not this individual's chair. He is a wheelchair user, but that was a chair that was a basketball chair that he wanted to use for fun. So please don't judge how terrible all that seating is and the setup. That would just be one of those initial assessment comments. Wow, that chair doesn't fit him at all. What could we do to make him more skilled? So as far as instruction, that is different than feedback. So it's before the person practices it, depending on their learning style. It can be written, it can be verbal, whatever their strengths are, you want to play to that. Giving too much instruction can really hamper one's ability. And we want to keep that instruction nice and close to the time that the person is practicing. We don't want to have there be too much of a distance. When we're looking at more advanced learners, it can be very specific. So it could be on the timing or something more refined about the skill that we might be giving them more instruction. And in the words of Elvis, a little less conversation, a little more action. You're welcome for me not singing that. All right. So when we look at what types of instruction we want to be giving, we know that when we look at advice speed versus accuracy are inversely related. So we want to focus on people getting it accurate first and then building up from there. We want to give them things to attend to look for. So when your feet get to this point, that's perhaps when you can pop your casters. Providing a framework, so something they can consider. So for an example would be if we're trying to get someone to coast between pushes, we can say, imagine you're paddling a canoe and you think of when you pull your paddle out and then you wait till the next time it goes in. Think of that when you're pushing. And verbalizing cues. We want to keep cues consistent and brief. So we don't want to, again, trying to get ourselves to speak less and instruct more through demonstration and other things. So cues such as pop or lean. So for example, that video that we showed of the young girl, and we want her to lean back as the cue that we would give her when she goes through the gravel. And that might be all we just say, okay, lean back and see if she does it. Focus of attention. So we want to make sure that you're looking at the outcome. So get this wheelchair up the curb, get this wheelchair over the threshold, rather than giving too much specifics about it. When we talk about focusing on a specific component or an action, again, that example of lean forward, lean back, that would be an example of what we might provide in training. And then, like I mentioned, overthinking interferes with the performance of that choking. So there's things we can do. We can have people either verbalize what their actions are, and so just to take their mind off of it, or we can have them think about something completely unrelated. So just focus on your breathing for this. And in this cartoon, I think what happened is I got used to tying my shoes without thinking. So then when I started to think about it, I couldn't do it. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. And so basically, we might want to use, if people get stuck on something, use a metaphor that isn't our body. So, you know, Linus, I think, is tying his shoes. Linus, imagine your hands are knitting needles and you're knitting. Now just do it. Get those shoes tied rather than focusing on the little details of it. Practice, practice, practice. Here are some of the characteristics of practice. So we're just going to go through each of these 10. All right, so specificity. So this could be, we want to practice the skill in what we're going to be using. So it could be you have a manual chair and a power chair. You want to practice with them both. You don't want to say, you know what, you got that power chair thing, that'll all transfer to a manual chair. It will not. The context, so what environments are you going to be using it in? And simulation is acceptable. So knowing that we have limited time with people, you may not be able to get them to every environment, but what can we simulate? So an example might be an accessible transit. Well, you can only ask accessible transit to come so many times and wait so long. So can we set up some of these environments so you can practice in something that's specific to that environment, but a simulation? All right, variability, I think, yep. So having practice variability will enhance our ability to transfer. So if you think of the woman who's popping up the curb, we don't want to just pop up a curb and then say, okay, you're fine indoors, and say, okay, you're fine for every curb you want to get over. That's not going to be the case. So we want to try a whole bunch of different varieties of different skills or context for those skills. We want to encourage errors in most cases. Again, when we speak to folks who have had a stroke or have other cognitive impairment, errorless learning has shown to be very advantageous. So that might be an exception to this rule. And then moderate contextual interference. So we might want to challenge someone to diversify where they're learning and the context that they're in. So the environment might be different. The learner may be tired. It might be we ask them to do a little bit faster, a little bit slower, or to multitask. So I want you to carry this glass of water while you do that, recite the alphabet, something like that, to add an extra challenge to the situation. Okay, thanks. So blocked versus random. Random is generally better for retention and transfers, but again, there are some situations where blocked is the preferred way to go. For children and elderly, it may be better. For people with cognitive impairments, it may be better. But it's again going to be individualized to the person that you're teaching. And consolidation. So we really want this skill after we've acquired it to be consolidated. So offline learning. Sorry, so for consolidation, I just got a little off there. If we think of something like we want it to be retained, like we want it to become the riding the bike situation. And so we want to make sure that we're not interfering with other learning at the same time. So avoiding proactive and reactive interference. So for example, with that, if we're teaching a complex skill, we want to give a period of time before and after that skill is taught. If we think of a busy rehab setting, we don't want to teach complex skills by different professions. So it could be that someone is learning a complex transfer to a vehicle, and then we're teaching them a wheelchair skill of a wheelie, for example. So we want to make sure that we're working as a team to do that. We can, if sleep can be very helpful to help with that and help that offline learning. So another thing that we can think of is just think of that last one you did. I'm going to stop you there. That was a great one. When you leave here today, focus on that and keep that one in your memory, and that can improve performance if we allow them that time to practice. Anything else there? Yeah. Okay. Amount of practice. So overlearning doesn't it doesn't mean that you're spending too much time. Is that you are able to do the skill and for the right amount of time, and you've had more practice than you need, but without doesn't mean practicing until people are fatigued and doing poorly. There's lots of different numbers as far as how much time people need or how much practice they need, depending on the complexity of the skill. And the main thing is that practice is important, but like it says, practice doesn't make perfect, only perfect practice does. So we want to make sure that it's quality practice. And at what point is too much? That point of diminishing returns. You're not going to spend 3 to 4 hours a day practicing a skill, and also knowing people's other situations that they have, other characteristics that they have. Do they have fatigue? Is there time of day that could be a practice that could be impactful? And we just want to make sure that people are continuing that practice so that they can have the skill retained and continue on to be useful down the road. Distribution. So sometimes it's important to mask that skill and to for discrete skills, but like Lee was saying, for continuous skills, we really want to have it distributed. So we want to have regular practice in a research or rehab kind of setting. We want to have specific times, could be 30 minutes, 3 times a week. Time of day can impact. So for someone with stroke, for example, they could have a time of day in the morning that's really good. There's some research that looks at older adults that say evenings are better. So depending on the person, but we just want to make sure that it's not too much time between the sessions if we want that there to be carried growth and that learning to continue. Whole versus part. It can be helpful to break the skill down or to chunk it or segment it. So I think one of the best examples of that is the wheelie. So you've got the takeoff phase, you've got the balance phase, and then the landing phase. We can progress that skill. So now we're going to work on takeoff, then we're going to work on the balance phase, and then eventually that becomes a whole skill. And we may be practicing the whole skill, but we may be focusing on a specific part to try and really build and hone in and get excellence in that area, but breaking it down, bring it back together. And it doesn't have to be just once. You can have the whole skill together and then say, you know what, I'm going to break this down again and take it to one part that we need a little bit of work on and a little bit of gain. So I'll just show you a little video next of segmentation. So this is an example of just getting over a curb. And so we're getting some feedback here as well, which we'll chat about, but that breaking it down to just the pop. So getting used to exactly how much you have to lift those casters up. Progression just refers to taking a simpler version and then getting yourself doing that very well and then building on it. So it could be making a curb higher. It could be making going a little bit faster. It could be adding a second component onto it. So we have one example coming up next. But there's lots of ways that we can progress it. So we can reduce the amount of assistance we have the person a little bit farther away, and that from a trainer perspective, that can be something that's challenging, and that you're like, when do I let the spotter strap go? That is an example of progression. So here's progression here of doing a drag turn. So starting by using just the hands on the wheels or on the wheel and the foot on the ground. The next is a drag turn. And again, we could combine skills with that and have that on a ramp, for example, to take it to the next level. There's lots of advantages to mental practice, and that it is no cost, it's in your brain, and that you can do it anywhere and it's safe. So imagery is, of course, very effective. And like I was speaking to on the other slide, where we're talking about what was that perfect, let's say, curb climb you did. You got over the curb. Let's just focus on that. And we're going to end there today. And I want you to think of how that felt. And you can also look at scenarios where you're actually just having people close their eyes and say, okay, now I want you to imagine, and you can give them instructions of you're pushing to pop the casters up, and then you're leaning forward, and what does that feel like? And have that be a guided experience as well. So there's lots of benefits to that. For people who are kinesthetic learners, you can also do the motions at the same time if that's your preferred learning style. And again, sleep is helpful, and frequency can be beneficial as well. And simulations is more of what I was just speaking to. So basically, we can set up different conditions. We can compress time and space. So if we have a short period of time, that we can make a different environment simulate what we need to, so that they can at least get that level of a skill. Yes, you still need to transfer it into practice in other areas. And virtual reality is something that's becoming much more accessible to people, more common, and there's a lot more research into that area. And then the last thing in our toolkit is the feedback, and there's the type, the content, and the timing. So the intrinsic feedback is what we feel and hear and see. Our augmented feedback can be augmented in all sorts of different ways. It can be like that video that we saw of the popping of the curb, where I'm looking at the mirror. It can be through videos as well. It can be a very effective method, but it's not always necessary. People can just learn on their own, and you want to make sure that people don't become dependent on, oh, that was good, okay, pop up this much, okay, a little bit more, and that constant feedback, so that when they do go to their own environments, that they're going to be able to do that independently. Knowledge of results is usually pretty evident. You either got up the curb or you did not. But knowledge of performance is what we provide more feedback on. And so if we're being descriptive, what's the most critical error? Again, the girl going through the gravel, you're leaning forward, I need you to lean back. And then prescriptive, how to correct it. So I need you to pop your casters, for example, and I need you to be 1 centimeter higher. So we usually start by asking people what they see and seeing if they can actually, if they have knowledge of performance as well, before we provide them with that information. And then the last one is timing, where we want to wait to make sure that they've had a couple attempts before we give them feedback, because again, that first attempt, there may be intrinsic learning going on that we don't actually need to provide. We need to provide the feedback. And then again, ask that person, well, what do you think happened there? How could that be better? And they may already have that information for you, which again shows that they're aware of the things that they need to work on. And provide that prescriptive feedback when necessary, that knowledge of performance. And so it could be, yeah, you just need to pop your caster this much, because they may not have a sense of how much it is. And then allow them the time to practice. Only give them information every couple of attempts. And then again, eventually just wean them off of that. In the beginning, you'll allow for much greater error. So that's what the gradually narrow the bandwidth means. So you will say, that was great. And then as it gets more specific, you say, okay, previously you would have accepted this as great, but now our standard is a little bit higher. So you want to make sure that they're building their expertise as they go. And also you can have people self-control feedback. You let me know when you want some feedback. You seem to be doing good here, but let me know when you're stuck. And the other thing we can do is you can have them do a number of attempts and then just summarize. Okay, what I'm seeing here is there's 2 things that you're doing as a group, or here's some things that we can focus on. It's also a very safe method if you're working with more than one person, because you don't want to point out anything specific to them that they're doing wrong. You don't want to say, John just did 3 things wrong and everyone else was perfect. Instead, you want to say, as a group, this is what we're seeing. Here's some things we can work on. And it makes it a much safer space for people to practice.
Great, thank you, Cher. That was give you enough lot of material to cover in a short period of time.
Yeah.
Now we're back to our outline here. We're going to talk about, so that's great in theory, but does it work, at least for motor skills, learning, and the wheelchair skills? Go back to our website, and if you go to the menu here on the left, if you go to the impact and publications link, it takes you to a page that looks like this. And we have a couple of things set up for a wheelchair skills test up here, but we have this set up. You click on that and you get an instantaneous PubMed search on the wheelchair skills training program. And as of last week, there were 75 papers in there on that, 16 of which are randomized controlled trials, and 2 of them are systematic reviews. So if you look at the level of evidence pyramid, there's all sorts of excellent and broad levels of evidence, but really when you get towards the upper end there, randomized controlled trials used to be thought of as the peak, but systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials has sort of superseded that, and it just keeps getting harder and harder. But just to give you an example of one of the systematic reviews that we did in the meta-analysis published a couple of years ago, and it's in your reference list. These would be the 13 papers that were available at that time, RCTs, and this is the forest plot. If you look down at the bottom there, you can see there's a net positive gain of about 20% over baseline. More so for people who were new users, just up here, than the experienced users, but both groups had significant improvements, for instance. Now that's sort of classic evidence, but it's also evidence such as Kirkpatrick's levels shown here. It doesn't take too much to improve somebody's satisfaction with what you're doing if they're enjoying it, but do you have a positive effect? Do you improve their ability or their confidence? And does that actually change their behavior? That's into the retention piece and use. And then does it have any impact on their life? Are they able to get back to work, get back to participation in sports and so forth? So looking at impacts is a little harder. This is an example of a paper that we published a couple of years ago, and it's looking at the wheelchair services received and positive outcomes in less resort settings. There's over 800 participants. And we're not going to go through all of these. These are 13 different services along the lines of the World Health Organization, and these are 4 positive impacts across the top, and a summary of them over here. But if you look over, just I'll focus on this one here, that if you look over here at how some of the individual services didn't have any positive impact at all. But the one that had the most was training. Did the person receive training? That was the greatest amount of impact on all these positive outcomes of daily use of your chair and increased ADLs, absence of serious falls. And as part of the 2023 WHO guidelines, they did a systematic review, an in-depth one. It was a group in Australia that was contracted to do that. And the training step received the strongest recommendation with the highest level of evidence of any of the 4 steps that were done. So training is pretty important, and it's acknowledged as such. We talk about the technology impact grid. You can have low impact or high tech or low tech, and the worst thing possible is high tech and low impact. We don't want that for sure. We'd love to be up in this zone, and we believe the wheelchair skills program is, and a visitor from the World Health Organization was the one who declared that we had met that standard, at least he suggested it to us, and we like the sound of it, so we've been using it ever since. But another way of showing that it's low tech is just some of the settings in which wheelchair skills training has taken place by our group, one or more members of our group, and you can see many of these places have done quite well. Most recently, Amira Tawashi spent a couple of months in the Ukraine helping to do wheelchair skills training there. She's returning later this month. As far as the metrics go, our website has had quite a lot of use. These are in your handouts, you can look at it, but our YouTube channel also has a lot of subscribers and a lot of videos. It's been going for a less period of time. The metrics help us suggest that we're having some impact. And the map here just shows where the most use is. There are 200 countries that have had have used our website, and the majority of them over 20 users per country. However, having said that, we've done a couple of surveys both here in Nova Scotia, but also globally. The global one, we had over 300 responses from 35 countries. And really, people are telling us that although they understand that wheelchair skills training is important, they're either not doing it at all, or if they are doing it, they're not doing very much of it. Typically 1 to 2 sessions, typically a total of 30 to 60 minutes, and caregivers even less. So what we feel is going on here is just the knowledge translation isn't going as well as it ought to. Typically, from the time something has been proven until it's in common use is about 20 years, and these couple of so-called death valleys that occur. And we think we're in this valley here. And today's webinar is I hope to kind of get it, increase the number of people, specifically occupational therapists who are assessing and training wheelchair skills. Remote training certainly is possible. Both the pull from the internet makes that possible, and the push of COVID. We did our usual course, which we're now into our 18th year of that. We had to cancel that for a couple of years there due to COVID, so we put on remote courses instead, and we decided to assess the most recent one just done in the fall of last year. And you can see the sort of pre versus post improvements in wheelchair skills, performance, or confidence. These are therapists who did this, over 100 therapists, and that's just been recently published. The link is in the reference list there, just published in June 2023, pretty recent. We also do run courses, as I mentioned, both in-person ones as well as the remote ones. A couple of studies that we've done with the University of Pittsburgh have shown us remote learning can not only improve your knowledge and your confidence, but can also improve your skills. Clinicians' manual skills can be learned remotely. And the second study shows that those who learn it that way can pass it on to their clients. So some evidence that you can learn motor skills in that way. So finally, a couple of resources. The Wheelchair Skills Program Manual, shown the main page is shown here. Version 5.3 is the one that's currently up there. Within the next month, we hope to be at version 5.4. But the chapter 6 is still similar in both of them. It's only 17 pages long, but it contains all of that detail that Cher was going through. It's all there in chapter 6. If you're looking for a more basic science review, as I mentioned earlier, this book by McGill and Anderson is just excellent, and it's in its 12th edition, so it gives you an idea that it's been pretty popular. So to return to our original goals, to better acquaint you with the principles, I hope we have accomplished that, and I hope that you'll also become more deliberate in your use of those principles. And we'd be happy to take questions either right now or by email, and that's in your handout. I'll stop sharing and